If you have your Bibles, you'll notice on the screen I say Mark 13. Of course, we will be preaching through Mark 13, but I'd actually like you to take your Bibles and turn to Daniel 11 if you have them. I am going to be reading from the Bible various passages that will not be on the screen tonight, so fair warning. If you have your Bible, this will be a evening where you might benefit from having it open. Last time we were together, we considered Jesus' prophecy of the time, which he called the beginning of sorrows. And we connected those events to our teaching of dual fulfillment in prophecy, recognizing that Jesus' teachings meet all of the requirements necessary for there to have been a fulfillment of the beginning of sorrows in 70 AD, at least as Luke describes it. This is not the complete case in Matthew and Mark, and we considered those differences a little bit. And as we did so, remember some of those differences we said between Luke and Matthew and Mark. Luke specifically speaks of his readers in that next section after the beginning of sorrows, seeing Jerusalem surrounded by armies, by which desolation would be inevitable. And Matthew and Mark speak not of Jerusalem being surrounded and then of people being persecuted until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled, but rather Matthew and Mark speak of the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place. And at this point, we have a decision to make. Is Luke speaking of the same event as Matthew and Mark and then just adding different details? Or is Luke speaking of a different event? And indeed, if Luke is speaking of the same event, then we would say, okay, the time of the Gentiles ends at the end of, after the abomination of desolation at the end of these things. If Luke is speaking of a different event, well, then the time of the Gentiles likely ends before the abomination of desolation, as Luke does not speak of it. And as a typical rule, we would typically default to believing that Luke is speaking of the same event, that the Gospels, being synoptic Gospels, they're all speaking of the same sorts of things, unless there's a reason to consider otherwise. And that's what we're going to talk about this evening. We're going to talk about the reason why it is that we might consider the abomination of desolation and Matthew and Mark to be speaking of a different time than that of Luke. And we're going to attempt to reconcile several facts together. First, that the similarities between 70 AD and the beginning of sorrows, as described really in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are too many to ignore the historical importance of them. But second, that the differences between 70 AD and the abomination of desolation are too many to ignore the prophetic importance of them. So the historical importance of everything that happened leading up to 70 AD and what we see in the beginning of sorrows is too connected to ignore. But then the importance, the prophetic importance of the abomination of desolation and the fact that there's really no way it did happen in 70 AD literally is also too much to ignore. And so our conclusion must be that the abomination of desolation is a yet future event. And thus we fit these prophecies into a dual fulfillment idea. The likelihood then is that Luke speaks exclusively of 70 AD, leading up to, of course, the Lord's return, so that within that first section. And Matthew and Mark speak exclusively of future events, leading us to the conviction that there will likely be another beginning of sorrows, leading this time not to the destruction of Jerusalem proper, but rather to the religious abomination of desolation. So let's walk through the facts as Jesus presented them as it relates to the abomination of desolation in verses 14 through 23 of Mark 13. Jesus says, "But when ye shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing where it ought not, let him that readeth understand, then let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains. And let him that is on the housetop not go down into the house, neither enter therein to take anything out of his house. And let him that is in the field not turn back again, for to take up his garment. But woe to them which are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. And pray ye that your flight be not in winter. For in those days shall be affliction, such as was not from the beginning of the creation which God created unto this time, neither shall be. And except that the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh should be saved. But for the elect's sake, whom he hath chosen, he hath shortened the days. And then, if any man shall say to you, Lo, here is Christ, or Lo, he is there, believe him not. For false Christs and false prophets shall rise, and shall show signs and wonders to seduce, if it were possible, even the elect. But take ye heed, behold, I have foretold you all things. Now, we have already thought through the facts of what Jesus is saying. We thought through that about 4 weeks ago now, where we actually just walked through the passage and considered the passage. Today, I want to draw the links more clearly to the concept of the abomination of desolation himself, something which I told you last week I would do. I would give you a real picture of the abomination of desolation, of the picture of it in Daniel, and then that's going to help us understand why it is that 70 AD is not the time where that abomination of desolation reappeared, and why we say that Antiochus Epiphanes was a first fulfillment of a dual fulfillment idea as it relates to the abomination of desolation. And to do all of this, as Jesus instructed us to do, we have to go back to the book of Daniel, where the abomination of desolation is first introduced during the prophecy of Israel's 70 weeks in Daniel chapter 9. And there in Daniel 9, verses 24 to 27, this is what we read. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins and to make reconciliation for iniquity and to bring in everlasting righteousness and to seal up the vision and prophecy and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the Prince, shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the Prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. So Daniel speaks of 70 weeks that are determined upon Daniel's people and Daniel's holy city. If we ask the question, who are Daniel's people and what is Daniel's holy city, we recognize that those 70 weeks thus are unquestionably directed toward the nation of Israel and the city of Jerusalem. Those are Daniel's people, the Jews, and Daniel's holy city, Jerusalem. This is our context. And God gives Daniel a sixfold purpose that the 70 weeks that are going to take place will accomplish. Purpose number 1, to finish transgression. Purpose number 2, to make an end of sins. Purpose number 3, to make reconciliation for iniquity. Purpose number 4, to bring in everlasting righteousness. Purpose number 5, to seal up the vision and prophecy. And purpose number 6, to anoint the most holy. And then God gives Daniel a measure of a timetable for these 70 weeks. The first order on the timetable is the command to rebuild Jerusalem. And he says that from the point that there will be a command to rebuild Jerusalem to the coming of Messiah, the Prince, is 69 weeks. Okay, so 69 weeks, and that's broken up into 2 sections. First, 7 weeks, and then another 62 weeks. Now, after the 69th week, once Messiah arrives, the prophecy says 2 things will happen after Messiah arrives. First, Messiah would be cut off. That's an idiom for him being killed. And second, the people of a coming prince, not the Messiah the Prince, this is another prince, it's the people of the Prince that shall come, will destroy the city and the sanctuary. So the city and the sanctuary, that would be Jerusalem, and the sanctuary, that would be the temple, will be destroyed. Now remember, when Daniel is reading this, the temple is currently destroyed. But he said already that the temple would be rebuilt even in troublous times. And then after Messiah is cut off, then once again, the city and the temple would be destroyed. So now we have this insight that of these 2 events, Messiah would be cut off, and the people of the Prince that shall come will destroy the sanctuary and the city. Now, following these 2 events, we have the 70th week, where this prince whose people destroyed the city and the sanctuary, will make a covenant with the holy city for 1 week. Now, this is interesting because the city is destroyed. Or maybe there's a big time gap between these events and the city's not destroyed anymore. But this prince will come and he will make a covenant with the holy city for 1 week. And in the midst of that week, the Bible says, he will break that covenant and then he will commit what the Bible calls the abomination of desolation. And the idea here is that there is a great religious desecration of the temple and of the worship system of God. And that is this abomination of desolation, where he will cause the sacrifices and the oblations to cease. He will no longer allow sacrifices in the temple, and then he will commit an abomination of which we'll learn a lot more to come. Now, we have no more insight than this into this prophecy or into these events through the prophecy of Daniel. But as Daniel continues, we are truly given much more information. And I mentioned last time that if I were to take the prophecies of Daniel and I were to set them side by side with a history book, I could cover something like 250 years of the time between the end of Malachi and the beginning of Matthew through Daniel's prophecy and a history book. And the place where Daniel's prophecy ends is actually at that place of the historical abomination of desolation. So what I would like to do with you this evening is I would actually like to walk through that with you. In a very brief fashion, I've done this before in a lengthy session where we walk through the intertestamental period, and I walk through a lot more history. I'm going to do that very, very briefly this evening. I'm going to read through Daniel 11. And as I read through Daniel 11, I'm going to put a timeline on the screen. And that timeline gives you the historical events connected to the verses that I'm reading. And we will see how the prophecies of Daniel in Daniel 11, many years before these things actually took place, well coincide, walk hand in hand with the history that we have from the historians of the day about this particular time in history and the events that took place, specifically with Medo-Persia and Greece, Syria, Egypt, and Israel. But before we do that, there's one more dot I need to connect, and it's about this idea of the 70 weeks of Daniel. We need to get an idea of what is the timetable of those 70 weeks. We need to understand that if we're going to gain a perspective on the abomination of desolation and the timing involved here. Toward the end, so all we've seen so far from Daniel is that there are 70 weeks. And what this means in the Hebrew is not actually weeks as we would think of it specifically. It's actually 70 sets of 7. And the vast majority of times that you see that set of 7 in the scriptures, it's speaking of a week. But in this case, the literal translation would be 70 sets of 7. And we ask, what are these 70 sets of 7? Are we actually talking about 70 weeks, as in 70 sets of 7 days? Or is it 70 sets of 7 hours? Or is it 70 sets of 7 months? Or is it 70 sets of 7 years? What is this 70 sets of 7? And toward the end of Daniel, we begin to get a little bit of a perspective combined with the book of the Revelation of Jesus Christ into this timetable. So we read in Daniel chapter 12, this is right at the end, verses 11 and 12, and the Bible says this: "From the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,305 and 30 days." So Daniel says that the time between the daily sacrifice being taken away at the abomination of desolation, which is in the middle point of the 70th week, and the consummation, which is what Daniel 9 says happens after the 70th week, is the consummation or the finishing of all things, is 1,290 days. And then there would be a blessing upon the person who came to or lived to or arrived at the 1,335th day. So we are given here days. And we put 2 more pieces together after this, unlocked through the book of the Revelation of Jesus Christ. In Revelation 12, John sees a vision. So at this point, we've got 70 weeks. The middle of that week is an abomination of desolation. The end of that week is the consummation. And then in Daniel chapter 12, we're given a timetable from the abomination of desolation to the end, which is effectively 1,335 days, with a particular note of the 1,290th day. So the 70 weeks cannot be days. We know that because we're given days in Daniel 12. Make sense? So then we go to the revelation of Jesus Christ. And we're going to talk about this a lot more next week. But in Revelation chapter 12, Jesus sees a woman. And a vision of John sees a vision of a woman in heaven. And she's clothed with the sun, and the moon is at her feet, and she has a crown of 12 stars upon her head, who gave birth to a son. And again, we'll speak much more about this next week, but that son was to rule over all nations. And this is a picture of Jesus Christ and the woman, of course, being Israel. And then he sees a dragon who is cast down to earth, who desires to devour the son, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And in Revelation chapter 12, verse 6, we read this. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. So the vision, this dragon that's cast out of heaven, who desires to devour the son, but the son is taken up into heaven, and then the dragon turns his ire toward the woman, and he desires to destroy the woman, and so she flees into the wilderness, and she flees for these days. And it's not hard to draw the picture of these symbols. A dragon, which the scriptures in Revelation explicitly state is that old serpent, the devil and Satan. And then we have the woman with 12 stars on her crown, that bears the child who would rule over all nations with a rod of iron. That would clearly be Israel. And the child who will rule all nations with a rod of iron is most certainly Jesus Christ of Nazareth. And so when Jesus is taken up into heaven, when he is protected by God, and the dragon, who is the old serpent, the devil and Satan, cannot get to Jesus, then he turns his ire and his ferocity against the woman who bore him against Israel. And so Israel, this woman, flees into the wilderness, and she flees for 1,260 days. Now, that's very similar to 1,290 days. As a matter of fact, there's only a 30-day difference between them. And then if we jump a few more verses into verses 13 and 14, we read this. And when the dragon saw that he was cast unto the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time, and times, and half a time from the face of the serpent. Now, in this account of the same vision, John says that when the dragon knows his time is short, he takes to persecuting that woman who brought forth the son, but she is given symbolically wings to fly into the wilderness. Similar description as in Revelation chapter 12, verse 6, where the woman flees into the wilderness. And he says that this would take place for a time, times, and half a time. That would be 1 time, a double time, and a half a time, or 3.5 times. So she flees into the wilderness for 3.5 somethings. But the text says that that's 1,260 days. Well, in that the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar, and a lunar year a lunar month is 29.53 days. 1,260 days in lunar times is 3 years, 6 months, and 20 days. And a Jewish prophetic calendar is a little bit less precise than that. A Jewish prophetic calendar is simply 30 days. For a 360-day year is exactly 3.5 years. A Jewish prophetic year calendar. For 1,260 days is exactly 3.5 years. 360 days is exactly 1 year in a Jewish prophetic calendar. And then to cap all of this off, we're in Revelation 12. In Revelation chapter 13, we read this, verse 1. And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, skipping to verse 4. And they worshipped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast. So I'm giving you a picture here. Then to verse 5. And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue for 42 months. So after this dragon begins pursuing this woman, and she flees into the wilderness for a time, a times, and half a time, or 3.5 times of something, 3.5 somethings, which makes 1,260 days, then there's power that is given to a beast that is empowered by the dragon for 42 months, which happens to be 3.5 years. Backfilling this all into Daniel 12 then, and Daniel 9. We find that from the time of the Abomination of Desolation, which would happen in the middle of the 70th week, to the end is 1,290 days, then another 45 days after that. Daniel 12, verse 11 says this explicitly. After this would come the end. Now we backfill that into the weeks of Daniel 9, and we come to this conclusion. If 1/2 of a week in Daniel 9 goes from the Abomination of Desolation to the end, and that would be, according to Daniel 12, 1,290 days, then 1/2 of a week was in fact 3.5 years. And that complies with the time where Satan is raging against Israel. So when Jesus says in Mark 13, when you see the Abomination of Desolation, flee into the wilderness, and then we hear of Satan getting angry and filling the beast with power to pursue after the woman who gave birth to the child for a time and times and half a time, or for 1,260 days, or for 42 months, then we get a very clear picture of our timing here, don't we? 1/2 a week is 3.5 years, which means 1 week is 7 years, which means the week is not 7 sets of days, but a series of 7 sets of years. So that 70 weeks is 70 sets of 7 years, or 490 years. And you see how we did that? We went from 1,290 days from the Abomination of Desolation to the end, to the Abomination of Desolation starts at a 1/2 week to the end. 1/2 week, 1,290 days. We have an extra 30 days in there that something's happening until the end. But 1,260 days is exactly 3.5 years in the prophetic lunar calendar. Extend that then to 7 years. Extend that then to 490 years. Split into a set of 7 years, 49 years. And then a set of 62, 434 years, making 483 years between the time that the temple is, the command to rebuild Jerusalem, and Messiah appears. 483 years. After which, the Bible says Messiah is killed, the sanctuary and the city are destroyed, and then a prince of the people that destroyed the sanctuary would set up a covenant with the holy people, the nation of Israel, the holy city, for 1 week, for 7 years. Then in the midst of that week, at the 3.5 year point, he will break his covenant and he will commit the Abomination of Desolation. Then from that point, there is another 3.5 years until the end, plus 30 days, plus 45 days on the back end of those two for whatever reason. Okay, so that's the timing. So that as we walk through Daniel 11, we're walking through a portion of this 483 years. Now let's walk through it together. Daniel 11. And like I said, I'm going to read Daniel 11, and then I've got a timeline here that's going to tell you what's happening in history at this time. Daniel 11, verse 1. Also, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Gracia. So Daniel sees a vision in the first year that the Medo-Persians overthrew the Babylonians. That's the first year of Darius the Mede. So the Medo-Persians just overthrew the Babylonians. And then Daniel says this: the first thing that's going to happen is there are going to be 4 kings that take place. Now, Cyrus, of course, is actually the king during the time of Darius the Mede. Darius the Mede was was a lesser king. He was a king over Babylon, but not a king over the entire empire. That was Cyrus. So Cyrus dies, and then just as the Bible says, 4 kings in Persia arise. Cambyses, then Smerdis, then Darius, and then finally Xerxes the first. That would be Ahasuerus. And verse 2 says that 4th king will be far richer than the other kings, and he will stir up the realm of Gracia. And that's absolutely the case. Xerxes, in 483 to 481 BC, went against Greece and waged an entirely unsuccessful war against Greece. Then Artaxerxes becomes king of Medo-Persia in 464. We continue then into verse 3. And a mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. This king that then stands up and does according to his will, this is Alexander the Great. Greece is stirred up, and because Greece is stirred up because of the campaigns that did not go well, then Alexander raises up and he starts his war against Medo-Persia, and then eventually conquers the known world. That's Daniel 11, verse 3. Verse 4, and when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up even for others beside those. In June of 323 BC, this man, Alexander, who had just conquered the known world, dies suddenly. And his kingdom does not go to his heirs. It doesn't go to his children. It doesn't go to those who were slated to rule. It goes to 4 generals. And those 4 generals break his empire up into 4 kingdoms. Alexander's general Cassander takes Macedonia. Lysimachus takes Thracia. Seleucus takes Syria, Mesopotamia, and Persia. And Ptolemy takes Egypt. And the scriptures now then zoom in after we see this idea that it will be broken up. And by the way, this is Daniel's vision of the leopard with the 4 heads and the 4 wings as well. We've talked about that. And now that this is broken up, we zoom into the conflict between Syria and Egypt. And the reason why we zoom into that conflict is because that is the one that's going to involve the Holy Land, the holy city, Jerusalem. So we continue in verse 5. He says, and the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. So we read in verse 5 of Seleucus becoming the king in the north. He was a former prince of Ptolemy Soter, who becomes the king in the south. So the king in the south is strong, and one of his princes, that would be Seleucus, then takes over in the north and becomes his enemy. Verse 6, and in the end of years they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. So this is Bernice. Bernice is the daughter, she's from Egypt, the daughter of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, and she is given to Antiochus II Theos, who's the Syrian king, in order to seal an alliance. However, Antiochus II and Bernice and her attendants and her son are all killed by assassination by one of the king's other wives, who was jealous that he just took another wife. And so she kills everyone. And this makes the brother of Bernice down in Egypt extremely angry. And so he takes the throne and he invades Syria to avenge his sisters. So we read in verses 7 through 9. But out of the branch of her, that would be Bernice's roots, shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail, and shall also carry captives into Egypt their gods with their princes, and with their precious vessels of silver and of gold. And he shall continue more years than the king of the north. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom, and shall return into his land. And this is exactly what Ptolemy does. He goes up, he conquers, but he doesn't actually claim the land. He just He did what he needed to do. He took his revenge, and he goes home. He brings a lot of stuff back with him. Verse 10, but his sons shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. This is Seleucus Callicenus. His sons rise to power, the ones that were following these assassinations. First one being Seleucus, the third Ceraunus, and then the second being Antiochus III the Great. And it's Antiochus III the Great that is zooming in on here, who overflows into Egypt, and he pushes back in Egypt all the way back out of the Sinai Peninsula and takes the power of the entire region for his own. Verses 11 and 12. And the king of the south shall be moved with choler, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. And he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. And when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. So Ptolemy then, having been pushed back to Egypt, Ptolemy IV, this is Philopater is his name, he's very angry at Syria, and he engages in another battle or another campaign. He gathers a massive army, and he defeats Antiochus, but he actually doesn't do anything with that defeat. He doesn't gain any territory. Antiochus flees back home, but there's no territory exchange here, which is where we see in verse 12 the idea that he will slay many 10,000s, but he's not strengthened by it. He doesn't actually increase his empire any. Verse 13, for the king of the north shall return and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with much riches. So after certain years, Antiochus III then attacks Egypt again with a much larger force after having been driven out by Ptolemy IV many years earlier. And you can see here on the timeline, again, I'm running through this quickly, but there's 14 years between those two events. Verse 14, and in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fail. Philip V of Macedonia, Antiochus III of Syria, and many dishonest Jews. This would be a band of Jews that were beginning to become Hellenistic. They were beginning to side with the Syrians culturally and thoughtfully. They will rise up against Egypt. So at this point, there is a league between Philip of Macedonia and between the Syrians, and then these leaders in Israel as well. Verses 15 and 16. So the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount, and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. Antiochus III takes Palestine by force, and he asserts Syria as the dominant world power. At this time, Syria has now effectively defeated Egypt and is standing as the world power on the stage. Verse 17, let's read verse 17. He also shall set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do, and he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her. But she shall not stand on his side, neither be for him. Antiochus III makes a league at this time with the king of Egypt, with the Ptolemies, which involved the marriage of his daughter, Cleopatra. This is not Antony's Cleopatra. That's like Cleopatra the third or fourth or something. But Cleopatra to the Syrian king, Antiochus. Now, both sides intended to use this agreement for their advantage. The king of Egypt, of course, not having any power now, wanted to use his daughter as kind of a Trojan horse to get into Syria. But when Cleopatra marries Antiochus, she ends up taking Antiochus' side in the battle. And so his deceit is thwarted because now Cleopatra is on the side of her husband. Fancy that. Verse 18. After this shall he turn his face unto the isles, and shall take many. But a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Without his own reproach he shall cause it to turn upon him. So Antiochus III begins a vigorous campaign into the Aegean region, taking many of the islands there off the coast of what we would understand to be Greece now. And then Rome commissions a general at this time as Antiochus is starting to kind of press into their area, and Rome has begun to gather as a stronger power. Rome commissions the Roman general Scipio Asiaticus to halt Antiochus's progress through Greece. And he is very successful at doing so. Verse 19. Then he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. So Antiochus is turned away from his Grecian campaign, and then very soon after that, in 187 BC, he dies. Verse 20. Then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom. But within few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. And this speaks of Seleucus the fourth Philopater. And he dies mysteriously, most likely by assassination. He inherited a great empire from his father, Antiochus III the Great, but he did not inherit any money. It was a great empire, but it had no money, so he had to raise taxes on everyone, and he particularly taxed Palestine. That would be the idea of him taxing in the glory of the kingdom. And then he dies, and nobody knows how. He dies very mysteriously. That would be by assassination, most likely. Now, at this point, the next 15 verses refer to the same guy. Now, you've noticed here, we've walked through a lot of history in these 20 verses. A lot of history, many, many years in these 20 verses. Now we're going to give the next 15 verses to one Syrian king. Now, if you're ever reading a big, long history, and in that big, long history, you go through hundreds of years in 20 verses, and then you stick with one guy's reign for the next 15, that guy is important. That guy matters. And that's what we're going to see as we continue. This guy matters, and this guy is named Antiochus IV Epiphanes. I've talked about him a lot. This guy gets the next 15 verses. So we read, verse 21. And in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. This is exactly how Antiochus got under the throne. He seized the throne of Syria from Demetrius Soter, who had the right to do so through insidious and flatterous means. He was a flatterer through and through. He was a schmoozer. Verse 22. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overthrown. I'm not, there you go. No, this is where I'm supposed to be. My apologies. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. So Antiochus, he makes a league with Egypt, and as a part of this, Israel's high priest, whose name is Onias III, is betrayed and killed. Thus, the prince of the covenant is broken. Verse 23. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. Antiochus IV rescinds the league made between his father and Ptolemy through the marriage to Cleopatra, and thus he begins this new campaign. Verses 24 to 27. He shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his father's father. He shall scatter among them the prey and spoil and riches. Yea, he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds even for a time. And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. Yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. And both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. And so we have here numerous things happening. Ptolemy Philometor brings his army against Antiochus IV Epiphanes at Pelusium, and is severely defeated due to treachery. the Ptolemy is captured, and he's treated very kindly by Antiochus. I told you Antiochus was a flatterer, so instead of being beheaded or whatever, he's treated very, very kindly. And then they start to get along. But they're both getting along, the scriptures tell us, because they're each trying to, through flattery, deceive the other. Now, it's during this time that the Jews hear that rumor that Antiochus has been killed in battle. And as Antiochus is heading back on his return journey, he thus takes time to kill a bunch of people and to spoil the temple in Jerusalem because he's angry at them. Ultimately, however, Antiochus IV failed to take Egypt, and he returns home with wounded pride. Probably a part of the reason why he gets very angry at Jerusalem when they're celebrating that they thought he was dead. Continuing in verses 29 and 30. At the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. Verse 30. For the ships of Shittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved in return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with him, with them that forsake the holy covenant. So here's what happens. Antiochus returns for a third campaign against Egypt. And at that time, a Roman emissary meets him and draws the proverbial line in the sand. This is where that comes from. And he draws a line in the sand, and he says that Egypt is now under Roman protection, and if you cross this line, you are now at war, not just with Egypt, but you are at war with Rome. And Antiochus knows that he cannot fight both Rome and Egypt, so he turns around, and he's extremely embarrassed, and he's very, very angry, and his pride has been hurt. So this time, when he stops by Jerusalem, he doesn't just plunder the temple and kill some people. He absolutely desecrates the temple. This is the abomination of desolation. Verses 31 to 35. And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword, and by flame, by captivity, and by spoil many days. Now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. And some of them of understanding shall fall, and try them, and to purge, and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. And this is where the rubber meets the road. Where Antiochus comes into Jerusalem, he kills many, and he commits this religious sacrilege in the temple. This will compel a revival of sorts in Israel, led by the Maccabee family, whereby they will lead to, an army against Syria in kind of a guerrilla campaign, and Syria will be driven out of the temple in 165 BC, an event that's commemorated every year through the Feast of Lights, also known as Hanukkah. Antiochus would then die in 164 BC. And from that day to Jesus' day, every Jew, it was even 3 years until the cleansing of the temple, every Jew thought that this prophecy was entirely fulfilled on that day, until Jesus gives the Olivet Discourse. And he says, in Mark 13, verse 14, but when ye shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing where it ought not, let him that readeth understand, then let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains. So all these things that Antiochus did, he erected a statue of Zeus in the temple. He desecrated a pig on the altar, sacrificed a pig on the altar, thus desecrating the altar. He killed many in Jerusalem. He sought to Hellenize them. All of these things happened, and the Jews said, this is the abomination of desolation. And look, we just read Daniel 11. That's the abomination of desolation. We can trace the history of this man. That is the abomination of desolation. And then Jesus gets up hundreds of years later and says, the abomination of desolation is spoken of by Daniel the prophet, has not yet happened. You're going to see it come in the future. Now, I stopped reading at verse 35 of Daniel 11. If we were to continue to read in verse 36 and following, we would find that the rest of these verses seem to speak of the same man, but they don't really line up with the person who was Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Let me read those to you, beginning in verse 36. And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. For that is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver and with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory. And he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. And at that time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. And he shall enter into countries and shall overflow and pass over. He shall enter also into the glorious land, that would be Israel, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasuries of gold and of silver, over the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. And he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. Now, maybe you didn't understand all of that, but none of that well applies to Antiochus. He did not reject the God of his fathers. To the contrary, the whole essence of the first abomination of desolation in 168 BC was that he erected a statue of Zeus in the holy place. He was attempting to get the Jews to worship his God, who was the God of his fathers, the Greek gods. He was married, so he was certainly not a man who rejected the desire of women. He never had kings from both the south and the north pushing at him after 168. As a matter of fact, in Daniel 11, he is the king of the north, isn't he? He's the king of the north, and Egypt is the king of the south. And he certainly didn't erect a palace between Jerusalem and the sea, as the text says he will. So none of this fits Antiochus Epiphanes. And that's fine, because Jesus said in Mark 13 that the abomination of desolation, as spoken of by Daniel the prophet, had not yet happened. And here's where we come back to the contrast between Matthew and Mark, and then that of Luke. Following the beginning of sorrow's description, Luke speaks of the city of Jerusalem being surrounded, besieged, and falling, and the city being trodden down by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles was fulfilled. And that's certainly reflective of history. General Titus of Rome, the son of Emperor Vespasian, besieges the city. As I said last week, he actually desired not to destroy the temple according to Josephus, but he was ordered to destroy it, so he destroyed it as he was ordered. They burned it, they looted it. Not one stone of its buildings was left upon another, exactly as Jesus said. But nothing else in Daniel's prophecy came to pass. There was no covenant with Israel for 7 years. There was no breaking of that covenant at the 3.5-year mark. There was no salvation at the end of that 3.5 years after a broken covenant. Of the sixfold purpose of the 70 weeks of Daniel, none have been fulfilled unto this date, unless we want to define making reconciliation for iniquity to be Jesus' death on the cross, and we can do that. Certainly not all of them have been fulfilled, which means that 70th week must not have happened yet. We cannot say that all of these things have happened in history. We cannot say that. Now, we can trace from the command to rebuild the city of Jerusalem to Messiah the Prince. We can trace those 483 years. Actually, there's a guy that's gotten a hold of me in the last little while, and he believes that the timing is a little bit different on that. He believes that you're not supposed to count every seventh sabbatical year, and so the years are a little bit longer. Haven't looked into it in total yet, so I'm not speaking to it officially. So I'm going to stick to 483 years for now. But those 483 years, we can trace them through history, all the way to the Messiah's coming. Then we see in history Messiah cut off. We see in history the city and the sanctuary destroyed. But we don't see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. We don't see a 7-year covenant with Israel while they're able to do their sacrifices, so that the sacrifices can be cut off. The sacrifices and oblations can be ceased halfway through that week. We haven't seen any of that yet. And we already talked about the timing. You say, well, Pastor, maybe it's not weeks, maybe it's years, maybe it's decades. We talked about the timing. The timing's pretty clear. 490 years. 7 years, 62, or 49 years, 62 weeks, leading to 483 years, 7 more years at the end. So we've got the timing. Jesus says the abomination of desolation is yet to come. And simply put, there is nothing in history that bears anything like the record of what the abomination of desolation describes. To this end, we are compelled to believe that the Holy Spirit of God inspired Luke to write a historical account with respect to the near history of the things in 70 AD, where the time of sorrows would give way to a siege of Jerusalem, of the overthrowing of the city and of the temple, just as Daniel 9 prophesied would happen between week 69 and 70, but that the 70th week, represented by a covenant between a great world leader and Israel, who would break that covenant at the 3.5-year mark and subsequently persecute Israel for the next 42 months, 1,260 days, or a time, a times, and half a time, culminating with Jesus' return and their deliverance, has simply not happened yet. Which leads us back to our interpretive strategies, both concerning time in prophecy and the nature of dual fulfillment. To give us confidence that the events of 70 AD were but the first and not the complete fulfillment of a complete future fulfillment which has yet to take place, where again there will be a time of great beginning of sorrows for the Jewish people, leading to an abomination of desolation, and then a time of tribulation such as the world has never seen, not to the point that they were writing it, not before, not since. So much so that if God were not willing to shorten it, which he will do for his elect's sake, no flesh should be saved. Filled with such deceits, miraculous signs and wonders accompanying the satanic works of that time, that if it were possible, even the elect would be deceived. Now, there's much more that's been left unsaid about these end times events. Some of that will round out next week as we try to fill in all of the gaps leading up to Jesus' sure return. I gave you a small glimpse into the history through the lens of Daniel 11 and Mark 13, but not through the lens of the greatest revelation of these things, and that is the book of the Revelation of Jesus Christ. I have preached that book. I encourage you to go listen to it. We will spend more time in it next week. But as we close for this week, if you've never heard me present this before, or anyone else for that matter, we walked through some 250 years of history in a single chapter of prophecy. And once again, I bring your attention to the nature of its fulfillment, as literal as it can be. I walked you through the history. What I did is I read a verse in Daniel 11, and then I gave you the historical timeline of what happened. And they lined right up. This is the God that has given us these things. He has told us these things. He has laid the precedent for their fulfillment through the fulfillment that we can see in the scriptures. Christian, these things will surely come to pass. Now, next week, we finish Mark 13. The next week after that, we learn the lesson that Jesus has, and then there will be one more week of lessons. As we get toward the lessons, Christian, establish in your heart the reality of the God that we serve, of the surety of his promises, so that when we hear him say, therefore, this is how you ought to live, if we believe the surety of what he has given us, as we've traced it through the scriptures, then let us believe with just as much certainty the commands about what to do with what he's given.
Thank you for listening to a weekly sermon of Legacy Baptist Church in Independence, Minnesota. While online sermons are not an adequate substitute for a local church in the life of a believer, we hope that its contents has served to assist and encourage you in your walk with the Lord. More information about Legacy Baptist Church and a library of sermons are available at www.legacybaptistchurch.net.